I want to make one point here about redistributing harm and benefits. Okay, so Mary Robinson was president of Ireland, and then she served as the UN head of human rights and justice, I think. You can look it up. But she started a foundation called the Mary Robinson Foundation, where they talk about climate justice. The first international organization that committed to climate justice as a human right, frames this as sharing benefits and burdens equitably. Okay, so this is something that took up climate justice as a human right. This puts these under certain framework under the UN, and then it becomes easier to ask countries to follow certain human rights regulations and the framework set up under the UN. Okay, so it has broader implications by just defining climate justice as a human right. Okay, like water is a human right, health is a human right, and so on and so forth. So the benefits and burdens associated with climate change and its resolution must be fairly allocated. In addition, those who have benefited and still benefit from emissions in the form of ongoing economic development and increased wealth, mainly in industrialized countries, have an ethical obligation to share benefits with those who are today suffering from the effects of these emissions, mainly vulnerable people in developing countries. People in low-income countries must have access to opportunities to adapt to the impacts of climate change and embrace low-carbon development to avoid future environmental damage. There are many concepts buried in there. When you say industrialized countries getting rich, you are talking about historical emissions. We will come back to this a little bit later on. If you look at the emissions from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution till now, majority of the emissions obviously belong to Europe and US and Soviet Union and so on. But if you look from 1990 onwards, let's say when we became keenly aware that emissions are causing global warming, then the equation shifts a little and China becomes a big emitter, India becomes a fairly big emitter, but US and Europe still remain big emitters. So sharing burdens and benefits equitably also becomes about how you assign past actions and past responsibilities. Obviously quite complicated, but there is another way to look at it or think about it, and I love this diagram which shows the Human Development Index, which is a combination of women's health, per capita income, access to education, water, family planning, and various other factors. And on this axis here is the ecological footprint. Okay, you can think of it as also ecological deficit, which means if you have a certain, we will come back to this, the hectares per person per year, that's the ecological footprint in terms of all the resources you use. If we convert that to a number of hectares you would need per year to survive with all your consumption level, then you can see that rich countries and the European member states have obviously a very high HDI, which means they have a very high standard of living in terms of access to healthcare, energy, food, water, etc. And their ecological footprint is also fairly high. Japan is up there. This also amounts to what's called ecological deficit. We'll come back to that, as I said, where you have a certain carrying capacity of this, let's say, per hectare you're using. If you're consuming more than what that land can produce, then you're essentially in an ecological deficit. Okay, so larger the deficit, the more harm you're doing to the ecology. Ecological footprint is very high. Okay, so if you go down to other countries, then Russia, China, Indonesia, India, and various other countries like Mali, South Africa, and so on, the HDI begins to drop off. Standard of livings are lower and lower, and their ecological footprint is also lower. What do you want to do? Climate justice means you want to be able to bring the HDI to a reasonable level for these countries, but you want to do it sustainably, so you want to keep this ecological footprint still low. So if these countries have already become rich by creating so much ecological debt or ecological deficit or ecological footprint, then how do you tell these countries not to do the same? That's what redistributing harm and redistributing responsibilities is all about. This is what we looked at before, where the global north has a massive footprint, global south doesn't, but in the future you want to reduce the total footprint and emissions, but also allow the same level of emission for the global north and the global south. So it's not just about population or everybody doing whatever they want. Plus, the other detail, of course, is that the rich countries often use resources from the poor countries. If China is the manufacturer of the world, China may be getting richer over time, standard of living is increasing, but its ecological footprint is going up, but also pollution of its air and water are going up rapidly. So there is a cost they pay for the low emission life or the low air pollution life that the rich countries live. So you are polluting elsewhere to get a better lifestyle in your country. So how do you assign responsibility? Whose ecological deficit is it if you're consuming and the forest is cut down somewhere, the mining is happening somewhere, manufacturing and pollution of the water and air is happening somewhere? So obviously climate justice is a complicated issue. So we will add other details to the concept as we go along, and we'll see that this is not so much about giving answers, but raising critical questions we all must ask of ourselves. And then action has to follow as answering those key questions. So we'll end this chapter with those key questions raised by the authors. A lot of these details I'm adding myself from my own favorite issues. The book is much more strictly following the climate justice aspect. So you can read the book chapter and see how to place my words into that context.